You know, God, when he created us, he gave us free will, and you'll quite often hear people talking about how we have free will to make a choice, and quite often we take that for granted. But in real terms, that's one of, if not God's greatest gift to us in terms of creation, in terms of how he made us. And part of the reason for that is that without that free will, we would be unable to choose him. We'd be unable to experience him truly, because without free will, we'd be unable to really obey him out of choice. And quite often when God speaks to us, he speaks to us quietly. He speaks to us in almost stillness. We know that when God speaks, God's got the power. It would quite easily turn up with a myriad of angels in a chariot and speak to us in a booming voice, and by doing that would probably completely overwhelm us, and that would undermine our free will. But God guards that gift that he's given us. He guards it with a passion, and such is his passion for us in terms of our free will that he speaks quietly. And the reason for that is that if he spoke loud every time, just imagine Moses on the mountain in that cleft of rock when the Lord passes by and just catches a little bit of his glory. I once heard a story about Billy Graham, how Billy Graham once had the devil appear to him in angelic Lucifer form, and the story goes that Billy Graham, he took all his strength and self-control not to bow before the devil because he was so beautiful. Now, can you imagine a scenario and a situation where Moses is on top of a mountain and God passes by with all his glory? Moses would have been undone. It would have completely and totally overwhelmed his free will, and he would have had no choice but to spend his whole life worshipping once he had seen God in that way. And that might be, some people might see that as a good thing, but ultimately Moses' choice and his ability to have a relationship with God based on his own desire to know God would have been diminished. And here's the thing, God doesn't want a group of people that are coerced. He doesn't want a group of people that are forced or bribed to want to know him. He wants to get a group of people that when they come to eternity, when they get to the end of this mortal coil, when they get to the end of this life, he wants a group of people that have chosen moment by moment to make choices to want to spend time with him. Now, God's not averse on occasion to undermining our free will on occasion. And I'll give you an example. Let's say with regards to addiction, when people are racked with addiction, whether it be heroin or eating habits or whatever it may be. And when God frees a person from that kind of lifestyle, what happens is miraculous. God overwhelms and undermines that person's free will by taking that addiction away temporarily. And it's almost like a child learning to walk. He then steps back and invites the new person, the freed person to follow him. And this is where thankfulness comes in. And we're told quite often to be thankful. Thankfulness is really, really important because it's a constant acknowledgement that I wasn't able to do this by myself. I needed help, and that help was there. And the problem with lack of thankfulness is, particularly in the area of addiction and freedom from addiction, we very, very quickly almost convince ourselves that we did it ourselves, that we were able to beat this on our own when we weren't. And then what happens, of course, is that we get tempted and we convince ourselves that I've beaten this once, I can beat it again. And in that way, thankfulness can render deliverance from addiction permanent, and lack of thankfulness can render it temporary. And for that reason, we must always be thankful for when God does intervene in our lives and where he does help us out in that way. The other thing about free will, what's the point in God creating free will and giving us free will? What's the point in that if there isn't an option to not choose him? In order for us to be free to choose him, in order for us to be free worshippers who've chosen him, there has to be an alternative. There has to be a choice that we can make that's other than following God. And this is where the devil comes in. Don't be under any illusions that the devil is the equal and opposite of God, because he just isn't. The devil is more akin to a jelly mold than he is to God. He is a created being. He is within the sphere of that which is created. We talked in a previous video about how everything fits into two categories, either God or has been created by God. The devil sits firmly in that second category, and the second he rebelled against God, and it's in the beginning of Ezekiel and it's early in Isaiah. If you search it out, it talks about how the devil was cast down right at the moment where he rebelled and realized that he'd set himself up in opposition to God. The devil had lost the battle because he relies on God for his very existence, but it suited God to keep him around. And the reason for this is that there has to be an opposition, there has to be an alternative, and that's what the devil provides. Now just imagine, for example, all the pain in the world and all the wars in the world, and people quite often say, how can God create this and God create that? Wars, for example. And just assuming for a second God stopped time and moved some countries around and just changed a few ideas and changed people's hatred for each other by undermining their own free will. What does that achieve? He starts time again, and in 6 months' time, a year's time, there's just as many wars as there were before. In some cases, there's probably more. And nothing's really been achieved, because ultimately our nature is such that we have this free will, we have a choice that God will not take away, because tied up with that ability to choose not to follow him is the possibility of having a relationship that's based on us wanting to get to know him. So the devil is there, the devil serves a purpose, and we struggle with things in life. We're habitual people. Habit forming is something from any form of life. As a Christian, as somebody who isn't a Christian, habit forming is like muscle memory. We can form good habits, we can form bad habits. People freed from addiction can realise that once they go back to that addiction, once they return to it, there's a possibility that God will save again. And lots of prayer and God can release a person once again from something they've gone back to. But it becomes harder. And the reason it becomes harder is because each and every time that God undermines that free will, each and every time that God cures somebody and heals somebody from an addiction, have a guess what thoughts creep into the mind of the person who's been freed. God's freed me once, he will free me again. All I have to do is pray. And we change from addiction to a substance or a state of affairs into a situation where we're not only addicted to that substance, but we're also addicted to not God, but an experience of God that frees us from something. And again, that in itself, an experience of God, is not God himself. And that's why God speaks quietly, because the Bible says that it's impossible to please God without faith. It's impossible to please God without faith. And that's because when God speaks to us and asks us to do something, there's always an element of faith in there. Again, God turns up with a chariot and angels and we have no faith. There's no space for faith. There's no faith when the truth is slapping you in the face. God wants us to choose him. He wants us to rationalise things out. He wants us to use our minds and our brains. He created them. He wants us to see things rationally for what they are. But ultimately, as we said in the previous video, he wants fellowship with us. He wants our worship. And he can't have that without our free will, without our choosing to choose him on a moment by moment basis, choosing to want to be in his presence, to be with him. Remember really early in the book of Job, where the devil comes and accuses Job of only worshipping God because there had been no opposition. And what God does by allowing the devil to take things from Job is create a situation where Job can look back and think, I've beaten that, I'm stronger, Because even in light of all the different things that were happening, I still chose God. I still chose him. I still put him first. And to be able to look back in eternity and think, this is how I live my life. Those challenges are an opportunity. Those difficult situations, they're testing. And what they do is they allow us to be tested, and they allow us to find that under whatever circumstances we're existing within, not only is God there for us, but we're able to rely on him. So think about free will. Think about how you use it. Think about the habits that we form. Quite often, martial artists will do what they call katas. And if ever you've done martial arts, a lot of martial arts are what they call katas, and they're like a set routine of moves that are one move after another move after another move that they almost have to drill themselves with till they know it off by heart. And the reason they do it is because when they're in the midst of battle and they're momentarily startled or stunned, there's an element of muscle memory where the body automatically falls back into that pattern without having to spend too much time thinking, and it allows a warrior to regroup, to get themselves back in the game. As Christians, we form habits. Some of those habits are good habits, some of those habits are bad habits, but making it a habit to spend daily time with God, using our free will in a way where we moment by moment choose him, is really important. But always remember, we're within a paradigm here. We're not in eternity yet. I remember somebody at church preaching about time being a paradigm within which we exist. Remember we talked a week ago about Christ making everything, and that time itself falls into the category of has been made by God. Space, it isn't God, it has been made by God. We have to understand that where we go after this place is outside of time, it's outside of space, and we're really just sitting in a box. And this box is something that's a set of rules that has been created by God as a paradigm for in which we can live, that gives us the opportunity over and over and over again of experiencing God, of choosing God. And then when we leave this place, we realise that in actual fact we genuinely have just moved from one room to another. But what we've done is we've moved from the spare room, the box room, and we've left that door, and there's a whole world out there. Now eternity is bigger than the whole world, but I suspect when we leave this place and we leave the suffering and the pain, we realise that it's but a split second in comparison with what comes next. But just remember, now we have free will, and we have challenges, and we have difficult situations. There'll come a point when we pass on to the next place, to the eternity, where we are entering into God's presence, where we can bask in his glory forever, without the cynic, without the challenge, without the pain and the suffering. And that everything we do here, the moment by moment choices we make to obey God and do the right thing, put God first, seek his kingdom first, those choices will be what will be joyous about them. There ain't anybody going to get to heaven and Jesus turn around and say, you know what, you took my gospel too seriously. If you ever mock somebody for doing the work of God, if you like the video, feel free to share it. By all means, like and subscribe, and I'll look to do some more. If you've got any questions or anything you want to cover, then please, by all means, just put them in the comments box below. God bless.